Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Central Library for this conversation about education. My name is Lloyd Wright. I'm the President and CEO for WFYI Public Media, and thanks for braving the weather, a good crowd tonight, and on behalf of WFYI and our partners, the Indianapolis Public Library and Chalkbeat, Indiana, it is our pleasure to welcome you to this conversation and an opportunity to be in discussion about school funding. There have been more than 20 conversations on education that WFYI and its partners have held in this space. Many of you have been a part of those conversations, and for WFYI, it's a part of our American Graduate Let's Make It Happen initiative, national program funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that shines a light on students' first big goal, and that's high school graduation. For the library and Chalkbeat, these conversations also offer a chance to talk about education and to bring resources in the community together around an open dialogue. So we're excited for you to participate tonight in this. Let me say thanks to our panelists who are with us tonight, House Speaker and American graduate. I like to say Beech Grove High School graduate, yes, like sir. Myself. Brian Bosma. Let's thank Brian for being here tonight. And Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dr. Tim Brown. Thank you so much for being here. And school superintendents from here in Indianapolis Public Schools, Louis Ferebee. Thank you, Doctor. And from Fort Wayne, Chris Himsel. Let's thank Chris for being here as well. Thank you. And let me also welcome those that may be watching the live stream at WFYI.org this evening. We will also have this soon posted on WFYI.org, so it will be available for you and your later viewing or for you to spread the word about this conversation on school funding. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome and thank our moderator tonight and our good partner from Chalkbeat, Indiana, Scott Elliott. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Lloyd. Let me also just reiterate my thanks to our partners, Chalkbeat, WFYI, the Central Library, who hosted us in this great venue, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the American Graduate Project. Oh, and additionally, we had some support from a sponsor, the Institute for Quality Education. Thanks to all of them. Okay, now I have to run this slideshow. We'll see how I do with that. This is just a few minutes. Funding is such a weird and complicated topic that we thought we would run through just some sort of basic overview stuff to prime this conversation. So, all right, this is working. Well, sort of. It's a little messed up there. What that says is, since the 70s, Indiana's been tinkering with its funding system. The state has moved away from local property taxes and toward a system that's been primarily funded at the state level. And since 2009, the general operating funds for schools have been 100% coming from the state. Property taxes now only support non-classroom costs like busing and school construction. How do we rank nationally? This is as of 2012 census data. There were just 2 states that spent a greater percentage of, so let me rephrase. There were just 2 other states where the spending on schools came more from the state than us. Indiana's at 51% coming from the state as opposed to local, federal, or other sources. There are only 5 states that rely less on local taxes to fund schools, but the state also spent less per student on education than the US average, so we rank 28th out of 50 states. Tax caps, I'm sure we'll end up talking about this tonight. This was part of the 2009 reforms that cap local property taxes. Some school districts have now hit them, and this has forced some tough choices. We've seen a couple districts, for instance, making major cutbacks on services like busing. Tuition support, this is the basic aid that funds operations of schools. Indiana provides some extra to support students that come from high poverty homes and have other challenges that can impede academic performance. Suburban districts are asking the state this year to guarantee every district receive enough funding to offer a quality program. We'll talk about that, of course. And urban districts or high poverty, generally high poverty districts, suburban's generally less high poverty, say they don't get enough extra funds to give all their students an equal chance to graduate ready for college and jobs. So how do we define fair? This is, I think, the core question with regard to school funding. This is an interesting and difficult question. Is it more fair for schools to have as close to equal as possible per student aid? Or is it more fair to try to pay each district's per student amount that's adequate enough for them to ensure students can graduate ready for college and careers? That's a tough question. Or is it some balance? How do you determine how much more money you need to give to high poverty districts to meet their needs? Really hard questions. Here's a look at the per student aid, top and bottom. Boone Township, which is in Hebron, is the lowest aid amount. The highest is East Chicago, and you can see there the differences. It's about $3,500 difference between the very highest and the very lowest in the state. This is just state basic aid plus additional money for factors like special ed and poverty and that sort of thing. In the Indianapolis area, this is maybe a little bit better, or for us who live here, more understandable example. Carmel is considered in essence the wealthiest district, and it has the lowest per student aid. Indianapolis has the highest. Let's take a look at these districts just as an example. You can see median income ranks second. This is income, household income, not school district revenue. Ranks second in the state in Carmel. You can see they have very low numbers for these various kinds of disadvantaged students. Indianapolis Public School, median income is significantly lower, one of the lowest in the state. And you can also see that the challenge factors are much higher. Carmel Clay's outcomes, suffice it to say that these are among the best in the state or the highest. IPS outcomes are not among the highest in the state. They are significantly more challenged. So here's a couple of questions. Do these outcomes suggest that Carmel schools are doing a much better job than IPS and therefore they deserve more funding? Or do these outcomes suggest IPS is in more need and needs additional funding to improve? Here's the complete, these are the most recent figures I could get. This is the complete funding picture from all sources for Carmel. And here it is for IPS. And you can see the difference is 2871 when you consider all sources. IPS gets far more federal aid, which is aimed at helping children in poverty. Carmel gets far more money from locally approved tax referenda. The overall gap, when you look at the total picture and not just the basic state aid and poverty aid from the state, is a little bit wider to the benefit of IPS, but not a huge amount. The total extra aid, the total extra of $2,900, the question is that enough for IPS to prepare its children equally as it is in a place like Carmel? We have Chris Himsel, the superintendent of Northwest Allen County Schools, which is a suburban district in Fort Wayne here, so I wanted to put his numbers up here as well. You can see that they are not a very high wealth district. Well, they are a very high wealth district. They're not quite as high as Carmel. Their challenge factors are not quite as low as Carmel's, but they're definitely on the high end in the state. And their equivalent to IPS is Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne, not as quite as poor and challenged as IPS, but certainly significant issues in those areas. These are the outcomes. Northwest Allen, again, among the best in the state. Fort Wayne, not as good. Here are the total funding picture for Northwest Allen and for Fort Wayne. And the difference there, if I didn't give you enough time to do the math, was about $1,600 per student is the difference in the totals. All right, so to wrap up my little presentation here, poor districts, often urban districts, argue that they need more state aid rather than steadily decreasing state aid. We'll get into that question. How much more would make a measurable difference? Suburban schools say that their per student amounts, many of them are less than $6,000 per student, is not enough in some cases to even provide basic services that people would expect. So the question is, can the state add new money to the system in a way that helps the wealthier districts without harming the low-income districts? Or should voters in wealthy communities be expected to just raise more taxes via referenda? These are some of the questions that are facing our legislators as we begin this session. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up now. A quick word on format. I will do some questions for the panel that they will all respond to, and then we'll have Q&A from the audience at the end. We have comment cards to fill out, and there will be people with the comment cards. You can get them from and pass back to the aisle, and they'll hand them to me. So just a little bit more about our panelists. I'm the Bureau Chief of Chalkbeat, Indiana. It's a website that covers education in Indiana. Brian Bosma here is the Speaker of the House, as we stated before. He's been a legislator since 1986, is that right?
Correct.
And I wrote 68 on my card by accident. Sorry about that.
I was in IPS. I was IPS in 68.
Yeah, sorry about that. He was an IPS. He represents the northeast side of Indianapolis, and he was a one-time Department of Education legislative liaison. Knows education very well. Tim Brown is the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, as we said, from Crawfordsville. And he is a physician. He was first elected to the legislature in 1994.
Correct.
Louis Ferebee, very familiar to a lot of us here in Indianapolis. He's about halfway through his second year as IPS superintendent, which I was kind of stunned to realize that much time's gone by. Before he came here to Indianapolis, he worked in school districts in North Carolina. Chris Himsel at the very end, as we said, from Northwest Allen County Schools, the suburban school district near Fort Wayne. He's also formerly worked in Kokomo and Lafayette, and locally here in Perry and Pike Townships. Did I get all that right?
Yep.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is just give everybody on the panel a few minutes to make some opening statements and maybe share their vision for how we can improve school funding. I've spoken to all the panelists in advance. We had a story on our website this morning talking about these issues. And the most interesting thing was, and not just this panel, but even in a wider sense, there's really very few people, I don't think I've met any of them, who think funding is working just great in Indiana. Everybody thinks that there's a problem. So everyone wants it fixed or wants it to work more efficiently. So why don't we start with the speaker. Tell us a little bit about your vision for how to improve it.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. And first, thanks to everyone for being here this evening. I've seen a lot of colleagues and friends, including a 5th and 6th grade classmate from Ralph Waldo Emerson School number 58 that I haven't seen almost since we left there. And really appreciate Chalkbeat, WFYI, and all your other sponsors giving this opportunity for the public to hear and also for us to hear as well. As Scott indicated, I've had a long history in education, including funding, expertise and experience. Worked for the Department of Education after some law practice and before I was elected to the General Assembly, and served many years on both education and Ways and Means. And at one time, and this will shock some of our finance staff, I was actually the resource person on our in our caucus on the school funding formula, David. I know you're going to be shocked by that. So I've actually authored my first study committee to study the school funding formula and try to provide simplicity, fairness, and equity. Those were the goals in 1988. That was first of a number of studies, so I have a long history of seeing it work and seeing it not work, and mostly probably not work. The reason that our team, and you've seen our agenda that is on the back of our handout here in blue, we've heard one thing consistently over the years, but really more significantly, as Scott has indicated, over the past year, and that is we need to, quote, fix the funding formula. Whether it's a school that has had a referendum that was denied, or a school corporation that has had to attempt to discontinue transportation funding, or you're in the growth schools with low complexity that have a low per student funding, or you're in a more complex school corporation like IPS, and you don't feel like you have the resources to deal with the problem that you face in education. Everyone feels like we need to do a thorough examination and take a hard look at the school funding formula. We do, if you look at the leaflet that Dr. Brown and I put together, you see that the 2013 figures that Scott was citing in his PowerPoint are even a little bit more exacerbated. And just for the school state support funding, there's about a $3,200 difference between Carmel and East Chicago. And that's about $4,000 per student for every student when you compare with the Title I money as well. So really a fundamental question is, and you asked yesterday, you had it on the screen here, I don't have the answer. We're searching for the answer, and what is fair? What is fair for a school that has a very low, we call it complexity, it really means lower income students eligible for free and reduced lunch. That's the complexity. That's what makes them complex under state law. What's right to give those students the added, and school corporations, the added resources they need to address those issues. And then is what is right for those schools that deal with other issues because they have low per student funding. One of the goals that our team has announced, Dr. Brown and myself, is that we want to put more into public education through the school tuition formula than went through it during the last biennium. The last biennium was 2% in the first year and 1% on top of the second. That's, depending on who you ask, that's either 2%, 3%, or 2%, 1%. But it's our goal to bring more to the public school funding this biennium, and I believe we're going to be able to do that. Then the question is, that pie is created. And as I was talking to Scott yesterday, it's like Thanksgiving. There's a pie, it's baked. And whether you have 40 people at the table, if you just have the one pie, 40 people at the table, or 10 people at the table, that pie needs to be divided in an equitable fashion. That's what the school funding formula does. It takes that pie that we hope is going to be 2% higher than it was during the last biennium in the next school year, and 2% more on top of that, plus or minus, in the next year. And how do we divide it? Our goal is to give more to each student through the foundation grant, is what we call it. And to raise that foundation grant, and then we have to look at the dollars that go through the complexity formula and determine how best to distribute them. So I'm not going to give you a lot of answers right now. We're really on a answer quest at this point, and very happy to hear your comments in this regard as well. One thing I can tell you for certain, this is a difficult task, and we know that. It would be easy just to say, it is what it is, and move on. The state's in a fairly good position now, and we know we can do better, and that is our goal. So with that, thank you very much, Scott. And we'll look forward to questions and further comments.
Dr. Brown?
Well, thank you. I don't have an education background other than I went to graduate school and school after that. So I've been involved in teaching a little bit at the graduate level in more a voluntary role than that. So I'll let we'll talk education policy to the people that are the experts. In my role as chairman of Ways and Means, I have to look at the big picture and the fiscal big picture. And I think the speaker adequately talked about, we set an appropriation amount that we think we can afford with the tax revenues that are coming in. You know, tax revenues aren't like Washington, D.C., where we can print money. In Indiana, it's what can the taxpayers afford? What are the revenues coming in? And we set the responsible level based upon that. So we set a level, and then we set the funding formula related to that. What's happening now quite a bit is because of property tax reform that actually started in 1976 under Otis Bowen that froze some things and started property tax relief funds and credits. And so that became so big in the state budget that only operations were 15% when we took over that last 15% in the last property tax reform. So all the problems we have a historical nature about every time we've tried to reform property tax to it. You know, some of the issues you talked about, transportation and debt service, well, part of the issue is during past recessions, not this last Great Recession, we allowed school corporations to take some of their operations from those funds. So in essence, some of the property tax still goes to operations, and we have to fix that. We have to correct that. But we've allowed flexibility to get through recessions in the late 90s, early 2000, before we even hit the big recession in 2009. So there's still a lot of historical things that we're going through and working through the formula. Our goal, I think, is, as the speaker outlined, and I've tried to tell people, is we're going to substantially increase foundation for every child in the state of Indiana. Our responsibility and obligation as a legislature is that every child, every 1.069 million students in the state of Indiana has the opportunity for education. We don't silo kids. Every child needs that chance for a quality education.
Thank you. Dr. Ferebee?
I think we can go. We've got to figure it out. Every child
Problem
knows
solved.
what they need. It's a pleasure to share the stage with this panel. I commend the legislators on their leadership. Had many conversations with Representative Bosma, Dr. Brown, and they've been very helpful. Also, good to be with my colleague here. You know, it's also great to answer questions not related to weather-related closing and delays. So thank you, Scott, for this opportunity. I am a proud member of the family business, proud educator, had an opportunity to serve as a elementary classroom teacher, school administrator, district leader, and now I have the pleasure of serving Indianapolis as superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools. With that said, I want to make one correction. I know on the slides, our letter grade designation was an F on the slide, and it is no longer an F at
I
this point.
apologize.
No
I
problem.
also, I did that just so you could get around it.
Okay, yeah, we try to celebrate.
I noticed
celebrate
that on the
everything.
slide, and I apologize. I wish
No
I'd have
problem.
corrected that.
We want to celebrate that, and one of the points that I will go back to also on the slide is the big question of what's fair, and I will begin the conversation with what I believe is unfair. And I had a colleague recently make a statement to a couple superintendents here in Indiana, and he said the greatest injustice is to compare unequals as equals. And I think what we can't convert this conversation to tonight and in the future is that someone has to win or lose. That there has to be this competition between low poverty and high poverty school districts. At the end of the day, I think we all want to ensure that every child in Indiana has the resources and opportunities to be successful. I'm very hopeful that we do that. And hopefully tonight we can have more conversation on how we do that. I'm well aware that there are a number of pieces on the pie, and we do have to divide the pie, but I want to ensure that we go to all of our pie charts and ensure that we are investing in education. I can't think of a better investment that we can make in our future than education. And so I just would remind the audience as we have conversation tonight that we're not talking about a new stadium, we're not talking about new roads, we're talking about our children and education. And so I want to make sure that the conversation stays on what matters the most, and that's ensuring that we give every child in Indiana opportunity to be successful, to take care of themselves and their families. So hopefully we'll get there tonight. And again, I commend the legislators on their leadership. I know it's not easy, but I'm hopeful that we'll figure it out, because that's what we do for our children. As a parent, I think all parents, we do this every day. If you've got a toddler and a teenager, you don't go to the teenager and say you're going to get less of this because the toddler needs that. You figure it out, and you provide children what they need, and that's my hope, that we figure it out. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Himsel?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for everybody being here. It's exciting to see so many people here interested in education. As the others have said, it's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists. It's my first time to actually meet Dr. Ferebee. I've emailed a couple of times to wish him the best here in Indianapolis, and I also remind him that not all winters are like this in Indiana. We do have some moderate ones here. Although up in Fort Wayne last year, we're off to a better start. We've already went 3 days here after Christmas break, and last year we were big 0 for 4 at this point. So we are off to a better start. But as the others have said, the funding is an issue. It's a funding for every single child in the entire state of Indiana. It's not limited to urban schools or suburban schools or rural schools. It's all of our children. Every single one of our kids, regardless of where they live, deserve to have a healthy and safe learning environment. They all deserve to be engaged in meaningful activities. They all need support when learning gets difficult, and they all need to be challenged to go further than they thought possible, regardless of where they live. And that's a team approach. That's not just schools. Those are also social agencies, which are also part of the issues that we have. As Mr. Representative Brown said, that big picture and trying to figure out how to make all that work. And we need to recognize that there are kids in need in every single one of our zip codes. And all of our communities have kids who we need to reach out to and try to help. One of the sayings that we have is that when a kid is loved at home, they come to school to learn. When a kid's not loved at home or somewhere outside of school, they come to school to be loved. And until they're loved, they're not able to start learning. And it doesn't matter where that zip code is, whether they come from a very affluent family or a very poor family. If they're not getting their basic needs met, they come to school looking for those basic needs to be met. And until those basic needs are met, they cannot engage in the high-level learning that we need them to be engaged in. And it's not about zip code, it's about making sure every single one of our kids have it. And the question for the state is it about basic learning, or is it about the learning that we're being held accountable to try to help kids achieve? And if that's the case, then it's additional funding for every school throughout the entire state.
Thank you. So what I'll do now is I'll address the question to each of the panelists, and after the panelist answers it, the other panelists, if they'd like to add something, just raise your hand and I'll invite you to do so. I'll start with Speaker Bosma. In our interview for the story that I wrote today, I asked you about the $2,900 difference between what Carmel receives and what IPS receives, and I asked you if you thought that was too much, and you said you think it is. Could you tell us why you think so?
Well, I don't recall saying that, Scott. No, I think the question, you asked me if about whether it was enough to fund a child that was more complex, as we say, or in impoverished situation. I said, well, there's 500,000 answers to that, because there's 500,000, roughly half of the 1 million students in that position. So the number's actually higher than that, by the way. It's $3,200 this year, and if you put Title I money in it, it's $4,000. All right, so now you multiply that by every student that's there. I had a group of Teachers of the Year, been my kitchen cabinet this year, and we've had some very stimulating discussions sitting around my conference table, and as I was asking them about, and they come from all kinds of schools, and asking them about this, I had one of them stop and said, well, here's a question. I said, what? He said, exactly what is that money used for? Where does it go? And does it make a difference for achievement and learning for that student? I said, well, that's an excellent question. And as I indicated yesterday, I don't know the answer for sure, Scott. That's what we hope to spend a great deal of time talking about over the next 4 months. The disparity between the highest and the lowest, to me, appears pretty strong. And I know the folks that are on the low end are pretty concerned about it. And frankly, this last year, as I indicated earlier, I've heard from more and more Hoosiers that are in all kinds of different school corporations that something's not working right. So that's why we're having this discussion and hope to make some grounds.
Dr. Ferebee, I'm going to guess you may not agree.
Well, I think what he's described, there are some outliers when you begin to compare some school corporations. And so I think that needs to be addressed. And if we need to provide additional resources where we see those outliers, let's do it. But I don't think it should be done by taking resources from one corporation or a set of students to another group. And so it is my hope that we would find a way where we have those outliers to increase funding. As my colleague, as Chris mentioned earlier, one way to do that is raise the foundation. There's ways to increase funding for maybe low poverty school district, and maybe you hold high poverty school district harmless. Those are the type of conversations that I would like to see. But if we have corporations that aren't funded at the adequate level, we need to address that. So I don't want that to be ignored. And truth of the matter is, across the nation, I mean, this is just not Indiana, education is grossly underfunded. And so this is a challenge that everybody is grappling with. But I think when we begin the conversation with comparing who has what and what the difference is between A and B, that's not the right place to start. Is if a particular school corporation or group doesn't have the adequate resources, the question should be, how do we increase funding for those corporations? And my hope, that's the direction that we go in.
So let me just follow up real quickly then. A really perplexing question is, how do you determine what you need, what it costs to help a child who's from a low-income family achieve at a level where they'll graduate high school ready for college and careers? How do you figure out what that number is? You're saying like you want all your kids to have enough resources to reach those marks. How do you know what the number is?
Well,
How can you figure it out?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we can't do is assume that every child in poverty has the same needs and that every free and reduced lunch student is the same, because it's not. So rural poverty and urban poverty aren't different situations. High poverty schools that have a high concentration of minority and high poverty students is different from some other schools that may have a lower free and reduced lunch number. So I don't think we can put a price tag on what it costs to educate our students. I think what we can say is we don't have enough resources currently, which means in my mind is that we don't reduce resources from select school corporations, but we find a way to support those that need additional dollars. But it varies from special education, second language students. We do a lot of mental health, social services, and I could go on, but those services don't look the same for every student. So it's difficult to put a price tag on that. So I wouldn't want to do that.
Okay, but I'm going to put myself in Dr. Brown's shoes for a moment. I've got to figure out how much more you need. You're the superintendent. If you want to give me raw millions of dollars, give me that. Like, what guidance? How can I figure this out? This is a really hard problem.
Well, I've shared that with Dr. Brown. I said, Dr. Brown, let's start with keeping me where I am.
He did share that.
And so I think that's where we start. Seriously, Scott, I think we start with how do we fill in the gaps? And what we're saying now is there are glaring gaps. There are some outliers. And I think the examples we saw tonight on the slides between Carmel and IPS is not reflective of the entire state of Indiana. And so what we have to do is figure out ways to address those particular unique situations. But I don't think it equates to less funding for school corporations like IPS.
I think I'd like to interject a little bit, and I appreciate the conversation I had with Dr. Ferebee. And yes, he did ask me that to maintain funding. And one of the things he shared with me was the cost per pupil of things outside of education that he has to pay for. Security, social workers, all those different things. And that's back to the issue I think Dr. Himsel said. You know, some of the issues for at-risk kids are outside of education. It has to do with do they have a single mom? Did mom make it home from work? You know, did dad get arrested for drugs the night before? And I think there are ways outside of the formula to fund that, outside of the school complex proper. And one of those, and I'll use a specific example that I have a little bit of feedback from, is Youth First Group out of Vanderburgh County that works with kids. They're social workers that are not school employees. And when they work with at-risk kids that are either drug addicted, suicidal, depressed, or have family situations that are chaotic, they get a 95% rate to college or career.
Thank you. Dr.
Before we
Ferebee.
go on, Scott, so I do want to do justice for our students and just say that we are very proud of all the students who walk through our doors every day. And of the 32,000 students that come in our building, regardless of the situation, majority come to school every day ready to learn. And so we embrace those needs, we embrace those challenges, we're proud of who we are and want to continue the progress that we're making. That's why it's so important that we don't go backwards on our funding so we can continue to ensure that we serve our students and families well.
Thank you. Mr. Himsel, did you want to chime in at all on this particular point?
I would just say that some of those of us who are considered those outliers, rural schools and suburban schools, when we've had our conversations with legislators, we have no intent of trying to take away from others. What we've been trying to do is to have a conversation of how do we engage having more money going into funding education for all of the kids throughout our state, and do so in a way that we're meeting all those needs that need to be done. Our proposals have never encouraged or promoted taking money away from anyone. That's what makes our legislators' jobs extremely difficult. And before we got into As we've progressed through the historical things that you alluded to back in, I think, 1973 was the first time we had the bill that was brought up with the property tax reforms with Governor Bowen, there was a difference between affluent communities with their property taxes paying a greater percentage on their property taxes and the state picking up a greater percentage of those that did not have that assessed valuation. And over time, that formula has been shifted and changed and so forth to the point where now the state has decided they want the entire responsibility, beginning in 2008, to determine that general fund per student funding that is used for our teachers, our instructional assistants, our administrators, our social workers, our nurses, our guidance counselors, that all of our schools need and have students who need those individuals. And so now the responsibility is all on the state on what is the appropriate amount and what is that equitable amount, because there's no longer an opportunity to have affluent districts pick up some of that cost through property taxes, as was part of the formula, and the state fill in the gap for those with less assessed valuation or less affluent districts. And now we've went to a referendum and our modeled state. And as our parents have told us and our community members have told us repeatedly, if the state took over the responsibility in 2008, why are they asking you to come back and ask me to pay more taxes again for something that I thought the whole point was they could take care of this? And that's part of the reason why we're part of this group, to try to help ask those questions, because that was a demand of our community.
That question leads me very perfectly into the second question I had, which is for Dr. Brown. So if we knew that the next 5 years was going to be a really big increase in tax collections, this would make our lives a whole lot easier. That's not the projection going out. So the question is given the fiscal picture of the state at this moment, can districts like Northwest Allen and Carmel be helped without hurting the IPS and Fort Waynes of the state?
So you're asking me for the funding formula today here on
That'd be very nice. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm ready. Mr. Speaker, can I give it to him? We're not quite there yet to decide how that's to be distributed and the funding formula. I think what we can see is that for available new revenue, that by far and away the lion's share are going to go into education. I think one of the things that we've talked about on the House Republican side, and even all members of the General Assembly, is yes, the last decade has been tough. If you really think about it, you know, we went through the greatest recession I think we've all lived through, and yet we're slowly climbing out of that recession. But we've officially been in a recovery for 5 years. Does it feel that way? No. And when we do look historically at school funding, we haven't kept up with inflation over the last decade, probably once out of 10 years. But some of it is the tax dollars haven't been there. Dr. Himsel talked about, you know, well, the state made it obligation. Well, part of the obligation was taxpayers said, you know, in reality, we want property taxes controlled, and we also want you to control state spending. So it's that dichotomy we continue to tug and pull again. But again, I think, back to the premise of the question, the lion's share of available dollars will go to education.
Can I address a couple of other things that are kind of, there's more background than comment on this, but it kind of addresses how we got where we are. It's been a long pathway to get there, and there are really two factors. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the changes in the funding formula. And because of the good, soulful pleas that you hear from schools that have lost students over the years and those that have gained students over the years, please don't change our funding. Please don't take any funding away from us to pay for them, whichever side you're on. We were chatting, trying to figure out, I recall in either my legislative career when I worked for the Department of Education, an ADM, a school average daily membership count for IPS in excess of 100,000. Okay? So there are about 30% of that. If 106,000 is the number, I remember 106 or 102, then at 32, they're roughly 30% of where they were. Now, I guarantee you they've not gone down in overall budget in any year. And even in those years, as we've moved forward and said, we're going to try to have dollars follow the child, not fund an institution, a building, or a corporation, when we've done so, it's been very difficult to do it and say, okay, so with that, Carmel or whomever, you're going to get more money because the dollars are going to follow the children, and you're going to get a whole lot less East Chicago or IPS, and then the result is, okay, we're not going to give you any less. We're going to give you a 2% bump. Even though you've lost these students, we're going to give you an increase. And so the disparity has gotten greater and greater and greater because the discipline is not there to say, or a solution, maybe that's the better word, a solution is not there to say, we can do this in a way that everybody's a winner and that pie just doubled and we can cut everybody a double slice, all right? So that's one issue that's gotten this problem further and further along. The second is the property tax caps. And I just want to tell you why the property tax caps came about, because the way not just schools, but all units of local government budgeted prior to 2006 was they set their budget and then the property taxes were raised to fill that budget, generally without control. And so there were places in the state, and it's not just in Indianapolis, but it was one of them, and just a few blocks up here, where real folks, real retired folks, had tax bills that went from $2,500 in one year to $7,000 the next year. Now, that's not just an IPS issue. That was every unit of government in Marion County, and that's just one of 92 counties in which some form of this was happening. So the reaction to that by policymakers, not just Republicans, some of our Democrat colleagues here, governors of both stripes, was to move forward on the property tax cap issue, and part of that was to cap property taxes, add a penny on the sales tax for every purchase you and I make, and then say, okay, no more operating expenses on property taxes. The state will pay all the operating, not just a third or two-thirds, depending on your district. And still, locals pay for transportation on the property tax, capital on the property tax, a debt fund, and a couple of other minor ones. So these two things together have kind of exacerbated the disparity that we have now, and I'm filling in a few blanks on it for the crowd.
And you've nailed our district, because we get it from both sides. And with the property tax caps, for some of our districts that did not do what you just suggested, which was to set the budgets and then fill in the property taxes, for those that did show restraint and control, that's part of the reason why there are some differences there. We are very thankful and we're very grateful for the change that was made a year ago to not protect those levies. If those protected levies had happened, we would have had 45% losses in transportation, and we would be one of the school districts that would be looking at discontinuing transportation, and that's saying a lot for a district that has 104 square miles to cover, and we don't have neighborhoods to have kids walk, and we do view it as economic development from the standpoint that many of our parents, in order to choose to move to our district by having both family members work, and that there isn't a stay-at-home mom in those situations or dad to be able to drive kids to and from school, and they are dependent on that transportation. That's a very important aspect to be able to do that. But the property tax caps definitely hurt us on that end. And then we also didn't maximize our general fund tax rates because no one knew that was coming up. So they were doing what they thought they were elected to do, being responsible, and so they got hit on both ends of things, and that's part of the price that we're paying. And then we also have annexation, which then creates some of our districts having multiple layers of taxes, and those are the real aspects of just trying to provide needs for kids. That in the process of property tax reform, the devil really is in the details and how it plays out for kids.
So to follow up on that, and I'll apologize in advance, I was not here, I don't think, in Indiana when this process began, but it has been recognized for a few years by the leadership in the legislature that there was a desire to narrow this gap between the high and the low. And so we're somewhere in the middle, am I correct, of a 7-year process, which is little by little reducing the high tuition support districts and raising the low tuition support districts. Okay, so in other words, your Northwest Allens are getting a little bit more through that process, and your IPS is getting a little less. When Dr. Ferebee and I spoke about this yesterday, he knows about that. He's planned for it. He said, tell the legislature, I'm ready for that reduction. Don't speed it up or add more. That's what he asked me. So
He mentioned it to me also.
Me also.
So this question is actually for Mr. Himsel, though. So this is benefiting a district like Northwest Allen. So a question that I've had from folks who are sympathetic to the other side of the coin is, why not let that process play out? You're getting a little more every year. They're getting a little less. The gap is narrowing. Should we let the 7 years play out and then see where we are?
It's interesting, as you go back through our historical things, we're about $600 per child less than we were in 2009 if just kept with inflation. And so it still comes back to the big picture thing that Representative Brown talked about, which is how do we find enough resources to meet all these needs and be able to keep up with inflationary cost. In 2009, we were at $5,015 per child as our state basic tuition and complexity. In 2015, we are at $5,008 per child in complexity and the foundation amount together. And then you add in with some of those kinds of things, our community wants to know, when we were doing our calling and we were finding out where we were with referendum, would like to know from the standpoint that they kept asking us and we didn't have answers, how do charter schools have $91 million of debt waived? And in 2007, 8, 1998, with the debts that we had with buildings with growing schools, that was not grandfathered in and treated differently with the property tax caps, even though all those debts were accumulated prior to the changes in the laws. And that helps contribute to then why we're also having conversations about why we are not having, may not be able to have transportation services and so forth. So it's a complex situation with lots of different moving parts. And there's been lots of different decisions that have been made along the way that cause people to say, I'm not sure I'm following where that's coming from. And the reality still is, in 2009 to 2015, we're at basically the same spot, and we've had inflation occur. We're in a unique position because Michigan and Ohio have not taken on some of these things on per student funding and some of the education funding. We're in a unique position because of where we're located that we lose some of our best teachers and our up and coming young teachers that are going to be our teacher leaders to Michigan and Ohio when they start having families and making these decisions of, yeah, but I could make more money over here, and they're making those kinds of decisions. And it's about quality of maintaining our quality of teaching force as well.
I thought
just
you might want to address that.
I want to clarify a little bit, and I hope, because the $91 million out there repaid to charters, that was because they went 6 months without any operating money from the state of Indiana. So I'm more than willing to give you a loan.
That would be a great answer that we could give to our parents, because our parents want to know, like in 2007,
I'm willing to give
98.
you a loan in 2017 if you go 6 months without funding.
Yeah, and the long answer to that is, when a new school starts up, a charter school, they are funded in arrears. They're not funded in advance like like a traditional public school is.
Yeah.
They're funded in arrears, so they had to borrow money at the outset to make that work, and so the legislature did determine it was best to pay that.
So I think we need to get that $91 million off the table.
But it is nice to hear an answer regarding that, but it still causes our parents to ask questions about, in 1998, we built a building to accommodate new students that are choosing to move out there. We do that again in 2005. None of that debt is grandfathered in and is subject to the same property taxes caps that all the other debt that would take on from the time the law changed. And it makes a difference.
Say that again, Chris. None of that debt
The
is...
debt that was accumulated under the old laws were not exempted from the property tax cap calculations, even though new debt that would have accumulated after that point is outside of that. Now, in 1998, they obviously did not know the state legislature was going to do property tax reform in 2008.
Yeah.
So, go ahead,
Before we
Dr. Ferebee, please.
I think about that
I
one.
comment, because I got taxpayers in the room. I just want to be clear that IPS does not receive the funding that we received, decades ago. We have had reduction in funding, and we've reduced our expenses over the last 3 years by 24%. So we have been good stewards. Particularly this administration has worked really hard to protect our taxpayer dollars.
And I want to be thankful of that, and my comments were not made in any disparity of that whatsoever. And I've spoken very, very proud of what you and your school board are taking on and some of the measures that you're undertaking. And we understand you have, schools like yours have special needs and concerns. Chris, I suspect you weren't serving a warm lunch yesterday on your closed school buildings, right? You weren't serving lunch.
We were open yesterday.
Were you? Oh, well, okay, you were.
We were open
I thought that would
yesterday.
work.
They're a little hardier in the north side of the state.
Oh,
They're-
darn it! I thought it was
He was
great.
closed today, though. He was
Well, my
closed
point
today.
was your crew was.
IPS
School
was serving
closed, but you were
lunches
serving hot lunch
even though they were
for
closed.
students that needed to get there. So we understand there's some special circumstances.
This actually sets up very nicely the next two questions, and you somewhat answered this, Dr. Ferebee, but yeah, I sometimes hear from critics of the high poverty districts this complaint that they are skeptical that the funding that districts are receiving now is being efficiently used. Do you want to respond in a little bit more detail to that? When somebody says, hey, you're already getting $2,900 more, like, what are you spending that on? That should be enough. Tell us a little bit about
So I'm being a little tongue in cheek here. I would promise you that many of those individuals have not been in our school district and have served high poverty students. I mean, you can't begin to describe the differences in what goes into the work that we do. So, I think that that's an unfortunate comment and perception, but we know from birth to K, before students even come to us, that there are stark differences in the needs. And so, I don't ever want us to get lost in some of those ideas and thoughts. Again, we're proud and we embrace every student who walks through our door, but this notion that you really don't need those funds, and what are you going to do with it when students come? I would challenge anyone to come and serve our students, and you'll see what we do every day.
Does anyone else want to comment
Well,
on that?
and I want to, again, a little bit bigger picture in different school corporations. I represent, and some of the districts I hear from lose students not in large numbers and budget for those. And I want to commend Dr. Ferebee's team to looking at the picture and what you've done, and I congratulate you on that. But we have school corporations that are losing 20 to 30 a year, and they tend to not react, and then in 10 years they're down 200, and they come and say they have to close a building, and nobody's ever laid the groundwork of why you have to close a building in a small corporation. And so that discussion about the children and money following the child and trying to raise the foundation for every child doesn't occur in some of those corporations. And again, that's when I get hit, well, just make me whole. It doesn't cost me as much for that little corporation. It's only, $200,000. It's not millions. And yet the principle is that we're looking at the children and funding a chance and an opportunity for all children.
Thank you. Before I move on, did anybody else want to address this question? This actually leads nicely, and we mentioned charter schools a moment ago. So Governor Pence's team today proposed some additional funding to charter schools, roughly $1,500 per student. I think the number that I saw reported was that added up to roughly $40 million increase to charter schools just from the $1,500. I hope I'm right about that. The total, the numbers you gave before, 2%, 1% over 3 years, is a $200 million-ish gain for schools, all schools in the state. So 40 would be a big chunk of that. This largely affects low-income schools because most of the charter schools in the state are located in the low-income school districts. Right. So to some degree, extra spending on school choice programs is also a reduction plan for high poverty schools. So could you address that extra problem that they have?
Yeah, let me first of all try to dispel a few myths about charter schools. I was one of the first advocates of it. I carried the bill that expanded their opportunities in 2011. Actually carried the first bill for charter schools like 1994 or some such year, and it took us 7 years to come to a conclusion. I see Representative Greg Porter up there, who was a co-author or perhaps co-sponsor. I can't remember how we did it now, but we worked together on this. And there are, and they're by no means a silver bullet, but our hope is to give every family, regardless, it's almost trite now, regardless of your zip code, regardless of your income, to give you more choices. And that includes great traditional public schools, that includes hopefully great public charter schools because they're public schools, and it now includes the opportunity for people to get a portion of what would go to their traditional local public school, not all of it, but a portion of it, and take that as a scholarship to, if they're low income, to a private school. That accounts for a very small amount in the big picture. I mean, we're talking really small. I didn't mention in the chart that you have before you that more than half of the tax money raised by the state, sales, income, corporate, not inheritance anymore, we've done away with that, we're still collecting a little bit of it, gaming, 51% of that goes to public schools. So charter schools are public schools. They have public school teachers, public school students. They're missing a few things. They don't get anything for transportation, like the local traditional schools do on the property tax. They don't receive anything for capital, like the traditional public schools can collect on the property tax, and they receive nothing for debt, other than the help that we gave them for those that started up and were carrying 6 months advance expenses, or in arrears expenses. So I'm not sure that $200 million doesn't sound right to me, David, but the $40 million may be right. But in the picture of the $15 billion, $15.3 billion that we'll be spending on public school education in the next 2 years, it's a drop. So.
But it's not for urban districts like Dr. Ferebee's. It's a significant reduction in his revenue.
You want to know where the charter schools are located? In the urban districts like Dr. Ferebee's. And in East Chicago, they're not in Chris's area. I presume there's none there. There might be one, but they typically locate in the urban districts. And I think we have 81 charter schools throughout the state now, 81. So we're really talking, people like to go off the handle on it and say that's the problem. In the $15.3 billion picture, a $40 million grant, that, by the way, we haven't hit that yet in 15.3. It would be the next. It would be the next placeholder where we touch the number. I don't find that to be upsetting to me really at all.
Dr. Ferebee, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so we got out front and had an opportunity to provide testimony to both of the legislators here on Public Law 1321. You know, I believe that's a smarter solution to deal with the capital and transportation.
Can I briefly interrupt you to explain 1321?
Okay.
So, would you like to explain it?
Yeah, so it's a law that was introduced and thankfully approved that provides traditional public schools an opportunity to partner with charter schools in such a way that we can share facility space and also share transportation costs, food service costs, capital costs in such a way that it supports not only the traditional public school and the charter school as well. And why that's so important is because, as we've discussed, in the boundaries of Center Township and Indianapolis Public Schools, we have an oversaturation of providers. And so we have, you know, traditional public schools right across the street, a short distance from charter schools. I mean, we just have abundance of schools, and we have underutilization of facilities as a result. And so in my mind, it's a smarter use of taxpayer dollars to maximize the facilities that we already have, you know, providing additional capital dollars to potentially build more schools, potentially in the city of Indianapolis. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because what that does, it puts us in a situation where we've got to now close another school. And, it's my goal that we protect every neighborhood school because we know our neighborhood schools are the fabric of our community. And so every opportunity I think we have to save our neighborhood schools, ensure that we take advantage of the facilities that we do have. And it hasn't been popular in some cases, but I believe that we serve the same students and the same families, so it's best that we share the resources to ensure that we have the most cost-efficient and effective manner of serving our students and families. And so we've already have partnerships underway that I think will better utilize our taxpayer dollars. I'm just fearful that with those additional resources, I would not want to see more schools built or developed in our boundaries, because I think that just challenges us more in terms of our facility usage.
Am I following you to say that you don't necessarily object to the $1,500 extra, or are you objecting to it?
So I think the avenues that we've created through Public Law 1321 is a smarter solution, but I can't ignore the fact that there are charter schools that are struggling with their operating costs. And there are charter schools in our city where students don't have access to transportation. And at the end of the day, I consider those students our students, and I want those students to have access to transportation just like the students that attend Indianapolis Public Schools, because I believe we have an obligation to all the students in our community. So if we can find a way to do that together, I think it's smarter than allocating additional resources in the way that's being proposed.
And 1321 was a great idea. In fact, we've talked about expanding it beyond just the Indianapolis Public School boundaries. And that's the kind of creative solution that some legislator didn't come up with. School did and brought it forward and collaborated and put it together.
I want to also hear Mr. Himsel. What is the suburban viewpoint on issues like school choice programs, charter schools, and vouchers? You probably don't, as we talked about, you don't have much in the way of charter schools in your district, but you probably have some kids that go to them and some kids that use vouchers. And also, the simple fact is that the money that pays for those programs still comes out of the pie that we talked about earlier, which you would hope to get more money from.
Our biggest issue at this point in time is those are parent choices, and we think that we provide an incredible opportunity for our kids, and I think most of the parents do find that our traditional public schools provide an awesome experience for their kids. We're very fortunate in that we actually usually gain more students from the private schools than we lose to private schools. And we just think it's because we work really hard at making sure our kids are healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. That's what we're about. And every single child in this state, as I said at the beginning, every single child in this state deserves to have a healthy and safe learning environment where they're engaged in some meaningful activities, they're supported when learning gets hard, and they're challenged to go further than they ever thought possible.
So let me ask you a question here. This is something I hear often from folks who are in the high poverty school camp on school funding. So when they hear a district like yours, top 10 in the state for median income, complain that they don't have enough money to offer the program that their children deserve, what I hear from them is, tell them to raise taxes. If their families are wealthy, you've seen it happen in wealthy districts like Carmel, Zionsville. I had a struggle, but they passed it. Why don't you do that?
As our community, when we were discussing with the referendum, it said that the state at one time shared that local responsibility, and in 2008 we made the decision that at that time the state was going to take on one aspect of that, and the other aspect would be shared with our community. And our community has basically said, we've worked hard to be able to move out into this district, and we don't want our taxes raised because we feel as though we were in a situation to share. We're not sharing anymore. The state's made that decision that that's a better solution. You need to go down there and ask the state as to why they're not providing that equity across the board instead of having me pay an additional tax. Now, if the answer that the state had is to go back to the sharing model, which I don't think they can do now, because we've boxed ourselves in with an amendment to the Constitution which provides a lot less flexibility on how to do that, then our community would rise to the occasion just like it did before.
So So Chris has fallen victim to the tenet that every public servant, you've got 4 here, you've got many in the audience, knows, and that is that everybody wants the service and nobody wants to pay for it. So, I mean, it's a rule.
Isn't that a Hoosierism?
It's a rule of governance.
I think that's a Hoosierism.
Oh, yeah, okay, we'll call it that.
So let me extend this question to the 2 legislators here. I came to Indiana from Ohio, and in Ohio they have a very different system, but it's very local property tax dependent. And what emerged over time was a system where there was basically an expectation that school districts would go to the ballot and ask voters to pass operating money very routinely every 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years if they want to provide the kind of program that Mr. Himsel is talking about. When I looked at the changes that happened here in the state with regard to funding, I thought to myself, Indiana may be going down this road. Are we?
We already are. We already have. So every school corporation is empowered as part of the cutbacks that have occurred, or the caps that have occurred. Every school district is empowered to have an operating referendum. And there have been 48 of those in the state. I believe 20 have been successful. And several have been re-upped. They're for a 7-year period of time where you can petition and put on the ballot for voters to decide, yes, we will pay more in property taxes for operations of schools. Now, I will tell you, Carmel had one, and when you I actually saw it from your chart. Didn't successfully ask anyone for the data, but as soon as I heard another legislator say, those guys get local property taxes too, I thought, boy, I just really wonder what that looks like. So as we were comparing IPS and by your figures, 2013 figures, and Carmel, there was still a $2,100 or some dollar gap. So yeah, there are 20 school corporations that have chosen successfully, campaigned successfully for that to happen. I know it's being requested down in Perry. I think there are 3 of them that are underway now. Perry Township on the south side, I know, has one underway that will be on the May ballot. There is some discussion to move them to the November ballot as we did school board elections, because so few people vote in the May in the primary. But that option is here right now. It lasts 7 years, not 3 years. We always do things better than Ohio, by the way. But maybe. But yeah, we're there.
Well, and I think that's also back to the issue when we look at the property tax revolt we both went through in '76 and then in around 2006. I grew up and have family in Illinois, and just kind of looking at ag property in the middle part of 2005, 2006, the school rate in Illinois was twice the rate in Indiana, but we were having a revolt here because there was a problem. So it's back to the issue, I think, Hoosiers do not like to pay taxes. And you talked about a fair funding formula. Everybody then asked, what's a fair tax? Well, the fairest tax is when you tax somebody else.
So, I mean, you may not like this statistic, but Indiana officially has the lowest residential property taxes in the United States with the property tax caps. Now, if your business is funding an operation from property taxes, that's not good news. But it was overwhelmingly supported by Hoosiers on the referendum, 72 or 3 or 4% in favor. And I mean, it has had a consequence that we've got to work our way through, but it's the world that we live in now.
So what Mr. Himsel told me when he and I talked about this on the phone was, I asked him that question. I'm like, hey, maybe wealthy districts like yours are just going to have to live with the fact that they're going to have to ask their local voters to pony up in order to even have basics. And he said, okay, well, if that's what the state is saying, it needs to say it. My voters need to hear it from you guys. If I go back there and tell them, hey guys, I need you to pass this levy, what he hears from them is, go back and get the state to live up to their end of the bargain. So what's he supposed to tell them?
Well, I think it's also back to the issue that, we've been paying a penny more on the sales tax. And so, they feel like, okay, I've been paying more in tax. And then a lot of local communities, we ask them to adopt a local option income tax. So they have that rate on top of their state rate. So I think that's back to the issue that I feel like I've kind of been taxed in different layers more than I was, or in different ways than before reform, and that's why I don't want to vote for a referendum.
But it still comes down to what is the basic cost, what is the basic needs to be able to provide education for kids? And is it to meet basic needs, or is it to meet the expectations that we're holding schools to be able to achieve? And we're struggling with that. We're really struggling when it comes to meeting all the needs that we have for kids and make sure that we get every single one of our kids to achieve what they need to achieve based on the expectations from the state. We don't have all the resources and all the needs that we do, and that's the reason why I think every school in the state is looking at some type of funding bump.
So let me just interrupt quickly to say we will be going to audience questions very soon. So if the folks who are going to hand out cards could begin doing that, there they are. Just raise your hand if you'd like a comment card, write your question down, pass it back to the end of the aisle. They'll collect them and hand them to me, and I'll try to ask as many as I can. I wanted to go back to Dr. Ferebee. In my conversation with you when we talked about these kinds of questions with regard to priorities of the state when it comes to funding, you said to me, we have to ask the legislators if prioritization is not where it needs to be with regard to education, and you made reference to this earlier. So let me ask also his question, which is, have we prioritized education enough? We've talked about how low our taxes are compared to other states. Like, maybe it's too low. Even though a large percentage of the state budget goes to education, that's partly a result of the way we fund things. Maybe it should be more. What do you think? I mean, what Dr. Ferebee said to me was, when we need to fix roads, we find the money. When we need law enforcement solutions, we find the money. When we need a stadium, we find the money. Do we just need to find the money? Does something else have to be reduced in order to make education where he thinks it needs to be?
You'd be surprised. You said the yeses, but you'd be surprised about the number of no's. Tim has a wonderful Dr. Brown, I should say. I'm sorry, calling everybody by their first name. Has a wonderful opportunity as the Ways and Means Chairman. It's also a horrible job because he says no 9 times, maybe 20, for every time he says yes. And people ask me, and I say, go talk to Tim. And we have to too. So yeah, that's why we're having this conversation. The amount that we're talking about placing in education in this next biennium exceeds as a percentage, what the projections are, right? So when we're talking about 2 and 2, or if that's what we end up doing, the revenue forecast doesn't say revenues are going to increase 2% and 2%. It's less than that. So we're prioritizing the money that is anticipated to come in to go into public school education. And this is not new religion for us, for our team. We have advocated this. It's been a priority for our team for years. And we may disagree with some of our colleagues about how it gets spent or how it gets distributed. But it's not just for our team, it's for your legislature. There's not a legislator. We might be able to drum somebody up if we sat around and talked about it long enough. But there's not a legislator who says, my goal is to underfund schools. Everyone's goal is to fund schools as best we can with the resources that we have. And I think the pie chart shows it. Between higher ed and K-12, it's 63% of your tax dollars. And all the administration that you're thinking of, what about all the Department of Environmental Management and this and administration and all that, general government is 6%. And that includes a whole lot more. That includes the legislature and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it is where the majority of our tax dollars, all of our tax dollars, go by far.
And let us put it in perspective, because you brought it up, Scott, about roads. The ask out there for roads is probably $2 to $5 billion a year extra. So we are not funding their ask in any way, shape, or form. We're making just a little drop in what they see for the roads and bridges and construction that we need in the state of Indiana. Medicaid, which is the second largest between K through 12 education spending, we pay a lot of providers 20 cents on the dollar You know, I hate to say it, do you want to pay your teachers 20 cents on the dollar for some of your high-risk kids? Because high-risk patients are the Medicaid patients. You know, that's just a fact of life. So those are the priorities in ranking. It's not like we've taken from education. We have made education priority one.
So, Dr. Ferebee, they brought their pie charts. Would you like to respond to some of what they said?
I think we all need to continue to bring our pie charts to the table. And that's how we get to our priorities. But I first want to say, as a new Hoosier, I'm willing to pay more taxes. And I think that's something that we need to think about. Because, you know, we talk about teacher compensation. We talk about workforce development. I can't think of greater avenues to do that than to increase our investment in education. And for the first time in years, we were able to provide our employees with a small pay increase. We're going into a bargaining session over the summer, and I want to be able to provide our teachers with a salary increase. But based on the reductions that we've already made, to be in a position to do that, it's going to be really tough if I have less funding in the next year than I have right now. And so those are the type of things that we're grappling with. You know, the governor talked about career and technical education. You know, I think those are the places we need to be. I mean, because if we don't do education really well, we all will lose. Everybody in this room, everybody in this state will be impacted if we don't do this really well. So I personally think it's worth the investment. And you know, we talked a little bit and joked a little bit about teacher salaries, but that's a real issue for our state. And I just don't see how school corporations like IPS can make that happen with reduced funding.
Mr. Himsel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, let's go back to we've just got to figure out a way to make sure that it's not just our basic needs of our kids. We've got very high expectations for our kids. We've got very high expectations for what we want them to achieve. We've got very high expectations for what we want them to be when they're graduates. We've just got to figure out a way to make sure that we have the resources to help them get there. Regardless of where they live, we've got to figure out a way to help them get there. You know, one of the things that Dr. Ferebee, because he isn't from Indiana, does not know, was in 1998 when I first filled out the 30A form for vocational funding. It was $450 for high wage, high demand. And in 2014, when I signed the vocational report this past, however many weeks ago it was $450 for high wage, high demand. And I believe
we recognize that. Yeah. We're working on it.
So when we talk about the importance of career technical,
you're right.
I think Dr. Ferebee, probably there's an issue that we're trying to work on too, and that's the special ed, which I've tried to figure out. It's been at least a decade and maybe more like a generation before some of the special ed rates have been increased.
It is complex. It is complex, but the real issue is just what is the proper investment for our kids, and how do we make sure not that they just do basics, but they meet all these expectations we have of them.
If I can add just one more item on the issue of tax increase, I don't really see that on the horizon, but there is some good news. We've at least gotten certain quarters to quit talking about tax cuts, further tax cuts, all right? So that is not a part of the debate at the General Assembly this year, because those cost money too. I mean, you work them into a budget just like any other expenditure, and that is not on the table in this 2-year period in any significant way. There may be something minor, but no significant tax cuts.
There's a question that I'm going to somewhat paraphrase and build on here with regard to the suburban districts like Northwest Allen. And the question is, you've said a couple of times about the need to ensure a basic level of education. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you're facing in that area? I know for me, about a year ago, I spoke with Zionsville's superintendent, Scott Robinson, about some of their challenges. It was a very interesting conversation. I know he's part of the group of superintendents that you're a part of. He's got some schools where they can't afford to have a gym teacher or music teacher on site on a regular basis. Tell us about the challenges and why they occur.
Well, and you know, we're no different than any other school in the state. In 2010, we were delivered the whole state was delivered with some bad news, and we had to live up to it, and we had to try to figure it out. So when I moved to Northwest, if we did absolutely nothing, we would have had a $7 million budget deficit. That's not acceptable. We've got to figure out a way to deal with that. So, you know, we have our teacher layoffs, which increases class sizes, which eliminated some programs for kids. We don't have guidance counselors for all of our elementary kids on a daily basis. And right after that happens, we end up with probably the worst child abuse case I've ever worked with in my entire career. And I've worked in Kokomo and Pike Township and Lafayette and Perry Township, and I think that philosophically some people would think the lower income areas is where that would occur. That's not true. The worst case I've ever worked with was there, and the kids needed a guidance counselor. We didn't have one at that particular school. You know, obviously we made arrangements for someone then to leave a different school so that those kids didn't have a guidance counselor to meet with those needs. But we dealt with the cuts. We took a 3% pay cut across the board. We tried to save positions to eliminate so that the hit on kids was less than what it could have been. But the ramifications of that is we've reduced what we do for kids. We've reduced access to foreign languages. We've reduced access to individual help through class sizes. We've decreased access to guidance counselors. We don't have social workers. Even though I've got one school with about 50% poverty in it, we don't have access to social workers. It's no different than any other school. It's the same kind of thing I'm sure Dr. Ferebee is saying, is that he needs more guidance counselors to work with certain students. He needs more social workers in certain areas. He needs access to more nurses in certain areas. The same basic needs that we're talking about. We've got them spread out. The difference is we just don't have as large a volume of those things, and so there's the perception that we can just deal with it internally, but we still have kids with needs. We still have kids who have those needs, and we don't have them in many of the areas. And we're just very fortunate we've got great people who step up because they love kids and they're going to do what's right for kids, and they volunteer. But there comes a point where the volunteer can't volunteer anymore because they need to go, they found a job somewhere else. And you know, when the unemployment rate was much higher and was 11, 12, 13%, we had a lot more volunteers than what we have today. And that's just the reality of where we're at.
So the first question is about vouchers, private school vouchers, which just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, the state has a program by which low-income families can redirect their state aid to a private school, particularly if they attend, I believe, a low-performing school. So this question points out that there's been some changes in state law that allow a growing percentage of kids to go straight to private school without ever attending public school first. The original program, you had to transfer from a public school in order to use the voucher. So in essence, you had to sort of try it out and be dissatisfied first. So the question is, isn't this money just supporting private schools? And the implication is, when we're so tight for money for public schools, is it proper to support private schools?
Let me answer that, because that was a discussion point, and in actuality, we heard that concern in the last budget discussion, because you know, the prior requirement was to be an ADM count somewhere. But if you weren't an ADM count, were you going to take away from the foundation of traditional K through 12 school? And we actually put extra money outside the formula, outside of our initial, you know, allotment for K through 12 to cover that ADM never counted. So it does not ever impact foundation.
Does anybody else want to address the question of vouchers?
I'll just say, first of all, we're not supporting private schools, we're supporting Hoosier students. And the Constitution, if you want to pull it out at some point, take a look to see what the General Assembly's charge, because I'm now giving this lecture in various quarters. There's one policy-making body for education in the state, and it's not the governor and it's not the Superintendent of Public Instruction. The Constitution says it's the General Assembly. And we have delegated some of that authority, a good portion of the authority, to the State Board of Education. But if you look at the Constitution and the responsibility of the state through its elected officials, it's to give an education to children by all means. And this is one means for some families. It isn't for every family. There are a lot of places where there's outstanding choices. Generally, there's some where there's an outstanding choice for everybody but this family. And it's targeted at low-income families, and even those that, for instance, are a sibling of a student that met that initial requirement, they were exempted, a few other students as well. It's a small number, and it's the opportunity for those low-income families to have another chance at another school.
Dr. Ferebee?
So, Scott, I don't have as much issue with those opportunities, and families are taking advantage of that, and it's been beneficial for some. I think, though, when you allocate public dollars to private institutions, we need to begin to think about the same accountability that we have for our traditional public schools and our charter schools. And I could be wrong, but I don't think the same accountability measures are there. And I think if you're going to accept public dollars,
they are in great part. It's not the headaches that you have to put up with, and that I think are outrageous, honestly, for our traditional and charter public schools. But there are performance accountabilities there, and there was a concern, and it may be a valid one, that there may not be a significant audit trail. As you saw, the Catholic schools came forth, the Archdiocese, and said, hey, some of our schools have been counting wrong, and we want to return $4 million to the state. People's jaws drop. Rarely does somebody come forward and say, hey, we've got money that we shouldn't have gotten, here it is. But that has caused us to think, is there a sufficient trail here to be certain? And it wasn't intentional, it was unintentional, not understanding the regulations and then discovering that they were being misapplied. So it may be, it's a worthy, isn't just a maybe worthy, it is a worthy point that perhaps we need to have some audit trail that's a little bit more significant to be sure that money's not being misapplied.
Anybody else? Mr. Himsel?
We talk about the questions that we have as public school servants. We just ask the question, and what we do have is, I do know in 2015 the foundation amount is $4,587. I think for this budget we're currently on. The maximum 1 to 8 voucher is $4,800, or $213 greater than the foundation amount for the public schools. And I just think that's something that we just need to be aware of.
But it can't exceed 90% of the local school where that child resides. It can't exceed 90%, not even 100%, 90% of the funding for that student if they were at that local public school.
We just know that the maximum voucher, according to the law, is $4,800.
And it's also limited by 90. Yeah, there's a couple actually together, Chris, but those are both there. There's 4 or 5 total limiters, and it's that 90% one that would.
It just causes people to ask questions.
Sure,
I understand.
it's a valid question.
This is getting pretty nerdy.
Scott's looking for something.
Well, thanks. Scott, you are the person who did a funding discussion.
That's very true, yeah. My children would tell you I'm the nerdiest one up here, that's for sure. So this is a fascinating question for a couple reasons. I'm going to follow it up with a follow-up I think connects to it. So this question is, could state tax dollars be spent more efficiently if we weren't funding 292 school corporations? Should there be an effort to make smaller districts pool their resources and cut their administrative costs?
Great point. I'll jump on that one. If you look at, I think the agenda we have on there, I can't tell you if we had enough guts to put it on there or not, because you start really getting reduce overhead and focus dollars on the classroom. That's as close as we could get to say schools ought to be consolidating. We have some school corporations. I was chastised for mentioning examples, so I'm not going to mention Randolph County, where there's 7 separate school corporations and a population of something like 35,000. I'm not talking 35,000 students. I'm talking about 35,000 people. There are school corporations as small as, fix me if I'm wrong, 250, 500 students. I tell you, people get all bent out of shape when you start talking about the basketball team not being around anymore. The last time that the General Assembly said you will consolidate was 1964. We are working on, and I've delegated to a good friend of mine, incentives to try to, and a simple one is if somebody wants to consolidate, actually there are examples of some smaller school corporations out your way and elsewhere that have consolidated. So we're working on some incentives. If you want to study consolidating, maybe the state needs to help you with that a little bit financially. If you need resources for that, maybe we'll give you some resources. And whoever put that in, hallelujah, praise the question, and you're absolutely right.
Well, I think just to follow up on that a little bit is that had some discussions with people in the General Assembly and actually educators, and streamlining or sharing services, as I'll say, is very emotional. And it really has nothing to do about logic. It comes down to ethnicity and community boundaries and whether I'll cross this county line or whether I'll even cross this street line because of a community of interest and ethnicity group in a certain locality. So it's very emotional. But then following up in some of those conversations you hear, the kids do fine. The kids do fine. It's the adults that have the problem.
Dr. Ferebee or Mr. Himsel?
Yeah, I can't speak for across the state. You know, coming from North Carolina, we had the same dilemmas, and same thing happened. There was incentives and mandates around consolidation. You know, what I would like to see is us, you know, deal with Center Township. I mean, we talked about the numbers of 100,000 now to 30,000, but actually there's close to 50,000. It's just close to 20,000 students attend charter schools, and about 50,000 are attending schools authorized by the mayor's office. And so I'd like to see some type of sharing of services, some type of consolidation within our own city. I think the work for Indianapolis Public Schools needs to begin there, because as long as we say, you know, separate and we're, you know, so many different entities within our city, it's just isn't a smart use of taxpayer dollars. And so we're not saying that we want to take control of what they do or what, and that they take control of what we do, but we got to be smarter, because what I'm hearing tonight is we're not going to get new dollars. There's not going to be additional resources. So you have to have ways to maximize the dollars that you do have. And I'm not one that is geared towards turf wars. You said it's going to get dirty. It's going to be clean with me, because at the end of the day, I care about ensuring that students and families get what they need and not necessarily who's doing it.
And Mr. Himsel, you might have an interesting perspective on this, since your district is sort of stretches from somewhat urban to somewhat more rural.
We are a consolidation. I mean,
Okay.
we are a consolidation, but
Yeah.
I also have family members in some of these small communities, and I know how passionate they are about that. The thing that I would say is I would commend the legislators for, if they're seriously thinking about incentives, to take a look at this, because I know that in a couple of the districts I've been in, we've had conversations about those, and the stumbling blocks got into some of the things that which contract, which sets of debt, and things like that, that there are incentives that were there. And my wife's family's from some small communities in Illinois, and that was the incentives is what got them over the hump to be able to take a look at some of those things. And so there's potential, because I think there are some communities that are having these discussions, but there's roadblocks to finishing the discussions, and this may be one of those things. That,
Dr. Himsel, could you maybe, is debt and contracts two of the biggest stumbling blocks?
I can only speak to the districts of which I was working in.
Okay.
And in the ones that I was working in, those were two of the stumbling blocks.
Because sometimes we ask those questions and we hear different things, and then when we dig down, because actually debt is not an issue, because under state law, debt stays with the taxpayers that originated the debt. So a new corporation wouldn't assume a higher level of debt. It would stay with the taxpayers that originated the debt.
I understand that, and we actually had that discussion, but that doesn't mean it got us over the
I understand, okay.
But, and then I would also say that every community, when it comes to consolidation, there are many different reasons, and I've just shared with you two of the reasons for the
Yes.
ones that in my example.
Yeah.
I would not say that some of the other districts I'm aware of, because I've got family members in those, that those would be the two stumbling blocks in those particular areas.
Well, and that said, we probably need to hear a little bit more if we're going to come up with those incentives.
So this just struck me as an interesting question. We just had a conversation in which the two state legislators here were very interested in the idea of centralizing services in order to save some costs. At the same time, in a county like Marion, we have pushed to decentralize the schools, and that would, you would assume, raise the costs, right? So is that in conflict? I'm talking via choice programs. So choice programs, where you once had far more, you talked about the IPS's reduction in enrollment. Well, a huge chunk of that is now in choice options in Marion County. They used to be in IPS. So that decentralized schools in the county. So wouldn't that do the exact thing you're saying that the rural counties should do the opposite, that they should consolidate and centralize? You're saying unconsolidate and decentralize in Marion County?
I'm not sure I'm saying that.
Okay.
But there is one school of thought that maybe the best environment for learning, free of a lot of administrative headaches, is a building governance. You know, not 85 building governance, but a building governance. And it's had all kinds of names over the years. Little Red Schoolhouse, that's just the one that leaps to mind. But empower schools to act on their own. In fact, school buildings, I should say, to act on their own. In fact, there is a measure that is sort of along these lines that is under consideration this session that would give school buildings, at the request of teachers and administrators, autonomy, sort of on the lines of a charter school. And really, it's along the lines of 1321 in some great respect as well. So we'll have that discussion.
And I think it's back to Dr. Himsel making some of the comments of what do we want to offer kids. That school corporation at 255, you know, can't offer the physics class or definitely the language arts, the French and German to their high school seniors. So are they as prepared as a neighboring corporation that isn't there? So, you know, I think there may be too big, and there may be too small. So what's the sweet spot we can discuss?
And we're on the cusp, you are on the cusp, and we're all on the cusp of some potential very fundamental changes in how education services can be offered through the electronic access that we all have now. I mean, it could happen today, but perhaps in a few years it'll be commonplace that advanced placement physics students are watching a Harvard lecture and working on a live lecture and participating remotely in a class. And it doesn't matter if they're at Washington Street, or if they're in Rensselaer. And it doesn't matter if there's 2 of them or 40 of them. And I mean, these things are exciting and they have their own problems, but they have the potential to present some solutions here in the future too.
Dr. Ferebee?
We have our own infrastructure still to get to too, because you know, we're a suburban school, but yet we've got one of our elementary schools did not have access to high-speed internet until just this past year. And so we had to come up with some very unique ways to try to figure out how to get digital resources to that building. But until this past year, there was no direct access to, because it just didn't go out there.
Really?
Dial up? You didn't have dial up?
We still have places where you cannot, if you live within certain parts of our district, you do not have access to high-speed internet.
We have broadband problem all over the state, and there are large areas of darkness in this regard, and we're utilizing not state resources, but not just state resources, including universities, Ivy Tech, and others, to try to open the doors, especially for K-12 schools that are in the position that you are, and businesses for that matter too.
So just real quickly back to the original question, in case you wanted to add anything, Dr. Ferebee, should all those choice kids be in IPS? Would that be a more efficient way to operate schools in Marion County?
I don't know what you call it, but I mean, at the end of the day, we've got probably 10 different transportation providers within the boundaries of IPS. we probably got more people that provide school nutrition services. When there's snow removal, there's probably 20 different corporations that go around and remove. I mean, so if you begin to think about the cost and scale of that, at the end of the day, it just doesn't make sense. So to Representative Bosma's point, I think you can maintain the autonomy of choice that drives the success of those environments, but still maintain some means of sharing services in such a way that you're maximizing taxpayer dollars. And in addition to that, we've learned and started to maximize our resources in the community by leveraging partnerships. And so I think through partnerships, sharing services, one of the things that, I've said to our school community, team always beats individual. And so as long as we continue to operate in silos, I think we disadvantage ourselves from being the most efficient and effective educational institutions that we want to be.
I'm going to try to read this question. It's a little bit long, but it was interesting. The effect of many of Indiana's tax reforms has been to shift the burden from businesses and homeowners, away from business homeowners, which makes it harder for citizens to okay referenda and generate funds for schools. If the business personal property tax goes away, one school district I know of will have its referendum dollars wiped out and more. How do they explain that to their taxpayers?
Well, they won't have to explain it for a while because we're not going to do away with the business personal property tax right now. That was a difficult discussion last year, and policymakers heard some of the hardships that it caused on schools and local government, and it's at least quiet for the time being. I haven't heard the folks that brought the initial proposal so strongly to the table speak much of it lately, and I don't know if you have, Dr. Brown, but
No, again, that'll all be local choice. If it would be something that school corporation, business leaders, city governments, and county governments would all have to come together. So talk about a true coalition.
Did either of you want to address that? I'm sorry, I didn't want to move on without asking. Okay.
I think they got the answer.
It was more your guys' kind of question.
Don't say anything more. Just go.
So this is a great question on funding that is often missed. It was missed in my presentation, but it's really a big deal. There's been this big growth in children who are in special education and children who are English language learners across the country, but especially here also. Will there be any effort to put additional funds into these underfunded services?
Was that you? Yeah. Doc, you better answer that one.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier that we have categories of special education from mild to moderate to severe, and want to commend Dr. Ferebee and his team because they deliver excellent services to this group of children in IPS. And the best I can get from historical perspectives, that it's probably been at least a decade before some of those numbers have been increased up in special education. And we know there's a preschool special education grant in the funding formula, and I know it's been at least 20 years for that. So I think we're looking at it. We have no answer tonight. English as a second language is a little bit more difficult because, as Dr. Ferebee has educated me, how many different languages are in IPS?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds. It's just not what we think that it's one or two. And within those English as second languages, there's differentiation from are you have no English comprehension to you have a little bit. What we grade, I think it's a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 rank. And so to say we're going to fund all English second language kids the same, I think would be inappropriate because there's such a spectrum and continuum of it. So this is something we do need to continue to talk about a lot.
I would just add, I think a lot of people are not aware of the federal guidelines around special education. There's this principle called maintenance of effort for special education, which basically says for every federal dollar that you spend towards special education, you then have to spend local dollars to match those funds. So we spend approximately $20 million from our local funds for special education. And you see some of the same expenses for our second language students. And I think what's interesting about our second language population, not only does it differ by language, but also the age in which the individual is trying to acquire the language. It's a much different process for a 10-year-old than it is a 16-year-old. So there's a lot of variance, very complex situation. But again, we're working to ensure that we honor every individual education plan for our student that is part of our special education program, along with our second language students.
Anyone else? Mr. Himsel?
The ELL, the English language learners, is very, very personal for me. All my kids are English language learners. And we're just very fortunate that at home we are supplementing dramatically. The issue is that not all of our English language learners get to go home with someone who knows English to be able to supplement what's happening at school. And the resources are very drastically lacking. But the bigger issue with ELL beyond funding's huge. Getting resources is huge. But the fact that we ask them to take an I-STEP test when they can't read a single word on that test is ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a, thank you. That's actually quite an interesting issue. I have a lot of thoughts on it. It's not a funding issue, so I'm going to let it ride, but we should talk about that more. This is a peripherally connected issue. Maybe that's too strong for me to say, but the question is about the connection between poverty and test scores, I-STEP scores, and I think what this question is getting at is this idea that's floating around about performance funding. So I think that there are some suburban districts. I don't know if Mr. Himsel himself is a proponent of this, who have suggested putting some kind of bonus or additional funds into the formula for districts that are high performing. And yet we know, as this questioner asks, that there is a very strong correlation between the home income of a child and their performance on state tests. So what are we thinking about that with regard to performance funding in the legislature right now?
This is hard. We actually have a chart, and I told the staff not to pass it out because I don't know that it's a fair comparison. But if you have the lowest 10 per student funded schools have the top scores, and the highest funded schools have the lowest scores. But I don't think it's the other doctors, not you doctor, the other doctors may disagree. We're all doctors up here, I guess. I don't think it's necessarily a function of funding. It's not funding alone, that's for sure. It's a question of what a student, and I got 13 teachers in my family, it's a question of what a student brings with them to school that day. And it was said earlier, I've been in so many venues today, I don't know what was here, if mom didn't come home last night, or mom works all night, every night, and I get myself ready for school. I put myself to bed, I get myself ready to school, and sometimes I get 3 hours sleep, sometimes I don't. It's so much more than that. Now, on the other hand, you have the schools who are getting the best scores and saying, we get the least money. So I'm not a person who says, absolutely, yes, we have to, the most money should go to the most schools. Well, then you're shortchanging those with the biggest challenge. Or we can't recognize you. I don't know what the right solution is. The place we've landed is, we fund with the foundation, we give extra through the complexity formula to those schools that have students that have extra challenges that have to be dealt with. And then we've set up a categorical performance award, and I think the number was something like $30 million this last time.
Yes.
And that went to the schools that had significant improvement. And that's a good thing. Is it a lot of money? Not out of $15.36 billion to put $30 million as grants to those schools that show significant improvement, but something. It's a little bit of a bonus for those that have really, and recognition for those who have really been able to perform and improve. So there may be some enhancement of that. It's not going to be such an enhancement that it's going to cause a penalty to those schools that need extra funds from the bottom up, but there's discussion of putting more there to, again, have some relevant recognition for those who are really significantly knocking the ball out of the park.
You know, you talk about performance and how much you spend, and one of your early slides, Scott, you talked about how we're below average, but we were 28th. That's pretty average to me. You know,
And
and
Slightly below
our
average.
costs are, I mean, if you adjusted that for the state's cost of living, we'd be up at toward the top, not at the top, but toward the top.
And I do understand with kids at risk that coming from a socioeconomic situation where they're not prepared puts them behind a student who is prepared. But there is nothing, the next step is there is nothing that is a corollary or a direct relationship that state spending equates with higher outcome. Because if you took that list 1 through 50 of the highest states, you know, your top spenders wouldn't be your highest outcome. And so that's the struggle we have. And it's back maybe to Dr. Himsel's question or statement, what is it that takes to make this prepare a student for what we need? And actually state money, again, has no direct correlation on that performance. We can talk about the student being prepared, but state funding is kind of a variable.
I don't use test scores to determine if we're doing a good job. And I don't think test scores should be part of this. I think test scores are way overrated. I think test scores are a piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
They're not the answer. And there's a bigger issue. The bigger issue is talking about what is the foundation that needs to be going into the funding formula. What is the basic amount that we need to be able to help kids achieve what we're expecting them to achieve? And I expect them to achieve a heck of a lot more than answering questions on a test correctly. I want them to be able to contribute in our communities. I want them to be innovators in our communities. I want them to be able to get industry certifications. I want them to be able to earn college credit. I want them to earn diplomas that mean something, that lead to something. I want them to become viable members of our community. I don't want them to be great test takers.
Dr. Ferebee, what if performance funding were at the school level? So I'm thinking of a couple very high-performing IPS schools, and I'm going to mention not the magnet schools, but the neighborhood schools that perform very well. School 90 and School 79 are the best examples that come to my mind right now. Those have been consistent A schools. They're high poverty, very challenged, typical neighborhood schools in IPS. They do very well. Should they get extra funding?
Yeah, so I support performance funding. I think, though, the schools that you just named may not be eligible for some of those dollars if we look at proficiency solely. So I'm a growth guy. I believe that if you take into account that some students will come on the first day on grade level, at the end of the year they're on grade level, and you've got 90% of your students proficient, but have they grown? And that's the question I think we need to get at with our accountability system. You make a point about investing dollars and does it improve outcomes? My argument would be, since we've been in the high stakes testing era, has our outcomes been any better? Are our students any better off than they were before high stakes testing? Those are tough questions to answer. And so, you know, and it was refreshing to hear State Board of Education members acknowledge that yesterday, saying that, hey, this is one test, one day, it's a lot on the line for our teachers and our students. And so I think until we get to a model that's heavy in growth, I think, you know, we will continue to disservice true accountability. And it's a phenomenon across the nation. Our focus on getting students to proficiency has diminished our ability to grow and provide rigor for those students that are already at or above grade level. And so we need to be held accountable for growing every student every year, whether they're below or on or above grade level. And I don't think we have that kind of system right now. And so if we're able to create one that truly does that and we can recognize efforts for growth, I think we need to do it.
Mr. Speaker.
It's not a perfect system, but that's how it is supposed to work, okay? So it does recognize not just raw score, but growth, okay? And it's supposed to be a balanced approach. It was actually an approach that we, David Long and I appointed a bunch of teachers to review from throughout the state to critique what the State Board of Education, the department, had done. And their ultimate process was, yeah, this does balance growth and raw score, and it is by building, if I'm not mistaken. It's not a corporation is high performing, it's a building is high performing. So we'll have to find out. I'm quite confident that there were some IPS schools on that list. I don't have it with me, but I'm quite confident there were. And now having said that, the measurement system ain't perfect, right? So, but we're dialing on it, and we're trying to make it better. We've had independently audited. We had teacher audited, and that was just what the legislature was doing. And we weren't even supposed to design the system. We were reviewing the folks that did design the system. So we are on the same page on that, and but acknowledge that there's probably improvements that need to happen still.
So we were just talking about accountability, and this question leads off with, in gigantic letters, let's talk about accountability. So this question says, and this goes back to the question of efficient use of funds, how do we ensure districts aren't funding millions of dollars for buyouts or large contracts for superintendents or shuffling failing principals around to protect their friends? Where are safeguards and transparency to ensure that? Do we need changes there?
We made some changes a few years ago, especially on superintendent salaries, because of some, again, isolated examples. I think it comes down to, school board meetings, and probably what these gentlemen would say, how many people show up at the budget hearings for a school budget proposal out there. And so it's back to the issue, our taxpayers don't want tax, but yet they don't come, though, to critique or evaluate or look at how it's being spent, but then complain because they think it's not spent the way they think it should be spent. I don't know how else you change that system, because we want Dr. Ferebee and Dr. Himsel and their school boards to do what they do.
Others?
In terms of transparency, every line item on the contract is on the website. Every single line on them, on every single thing, was published in the newspaper, was handed to every reporter. That's part of the law. I'm not sure how much more transparent you can get than to have every single line item handed to a reporter and handed to every person who attends the meeting, and have it published in the paper and on your website.
Yeah, and the vast majority, as Tim has said, the vast majority of school boards, not everyone, but the vast majority of school boards are locally elected. And they're there to represent taxpayers, parents, and everyone, and assure that these things are not happening at an administrative level. And honestly, when the General Assembly has tried to be a big, statewide school board and micromanage those things, we jack them up. So we try to give the local communities as much leeway in that as possible, because education is a local issue. We fund it, we fool around with it, but ultimately what happens in local schools is up to local principals, local superintendents, local school board members, local parents, local communities.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I know that everyone would love to keep talking about school funding for hours beyond this. But this has been just a fantastic panel. This turnout on a cold January day.
Very impressive.
Very, very impressive. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate you all. Chris Himsel drove all the way down from Fort Wayne today. Thank you for coming, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Ferebee. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And also just a final thank you to our partners, Chalkbeat, WFYI, the Central Library, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, American Graduate Project, and our sponsor, the Institute for Quality of Education. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Scott, very helpful.